He handed her his umbrella and walked away without knowing he had just been given a new chance at life. The rain smelled like wet pavement and old coffee. The city lights blurred into halos against the haze, and the bus shelter hummed with distant exhaust and the rustle of newspapers. Maria was there, fingers raw from the cold, a thin jacket that had seen better winters, and a toddler asleep against her chest. She was 32, a single mother balancing double shifts and school nights, a woman whose name people passed by like they passed the same cracked tile on the sidewalk. The man under the umbrella was Mark Ellis, CEO of a small tech company, a man with the kind of suits that folded into meetings and a phone that never stopped ringing. "Keep it," she said, pressing the handle into his hand with a voice steady as a practiced promise. He paused, surprised, then smiled in that distracted way of someone who lives inside calendars, and said, "I insist." She shook her head and tucked the umbrella beside their small heap of plastic bags. She had no idea that 3 days later she would be the person pulling him back from the brink, that the simple hold of an umbrella would begin a chain that bent both their lives into unexpected shape. What follows is about dignity and small gestures, and how one woman, carrying her child and her courage, kept turning up at the moments that saved a life and changed a company. Maria closed the bus shelter door behind them, and the rain pitched itself into the gutters with a steady percussion that felt like a metronome counting down a tired week. The bus smelled of lemon disinfectant and hot metal, Lucy's hair smelled faintly of applesauce, and Maria's hands smelled of detergent and the peppery tang of the cheap stew she had made that morning. She pushed the stroller with practiced care, nodding to Mrs. Rivera, who collected cans on the corner, and to Tony from upstairs, who waved with a gloved thumb. Her apartment on the 3rd floor above the bakery had a draft that found the seam of the window and a radiator that made a comforting clank in the night. She worked 2 jobs, cleaning office towers and stocking shelves at midnight, hours stitched together with the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the shuffle of paper. On Sunday mornings she took Lucy to the library, where the pages smelled like crayons and dust, and the librarian, Jenna, always saved the best picture books. Maria managed bills with a ledger kept in her head, promises to landlords made with a hopeful tone, and small compromises. She kept a folder with Lucy's drawings, a faded Polaroid of her parents before the accident, a receipt from the first day she bought Lucy a pair of sneakers that did not leak. Those objects were her compass. They held the memory of a life that had been interrupted by loss and the weight of small, steady choices that kept them afloat. The backstory of Maria unfurled in long breaths and careful details. She had been raised in a house where the smell of cooking was constant and laughter was loud, until the night a drunk driver stole the sound of her parents. As a child, she learned to measure love in chores done and stories told twice so a small listener would sleep. School had been a refuge at first, the chalk dust like soft snowfall on the desk, but financial necessity sent her to work earlier than any teenager wanted to. She studied hospitality in a community college while balancing shifts at a diner where the coffee was bitter but the regulars called her by name and left tips in folded bills. The first time she held Lucy, she felt both the cradle of hope and the pinch of fear. Single motherhood rearranged her days into spare parts of sacrifice and tenderness. She had dreams of returning to night classes, perhaps nursing or social work, something that would let her be steady for others as she had tried to be steady for Lucy. Yet the present resisted the map of those plans. A broken heater the winter after Lucy turned 5, a landlord named Carlos who promised repairs and delayed them, a boss named Priya at the grocery who asked for overtime with a weary smile, all layered into a life marked by dignity and cost. Through it all, Maria kept a small ritual of lighting a scented candle on the 1st of each month, a private insistence on warmth even when budgets forbade it. The folder with Lucy's drawings grew thicker, each picture a small contract with a future she hoped to buy one day. She carried her backstory like a quiet instrument, the tone of childhood memories, the texture of late nights and early alarms. Education had been a promise made, with textbooks that smelled like glue and the taste of stale chips during study sessions. The loss of her parents had taught her to fold grief into purpose rather than let it unmoor her. She learned to be practical with time and generous with attention. In her 20s, she volunteered at a soup kitchen, where the clank of pots and the murmur of thanks became another language of care.
Those evenings taught her that dignity was found not only in receiving help, but in offering it with the same hands that needed it. She met Tony then, a neighbor with a laugh that defied the building's brown paint, and a willingness to hold Lucy during quick errands when a shift ran late. Names like Jenna, Carlos, Priya, and Mrs. Rivera threaded across the years like steady planks on a path. Each person had a small role in the scaffolding that kept Maria upright. This backstory, gathered and worn but not broken, explained her patience and the quiet courage that would,
later, put her at the center of 3 improbable rescues. The moment the umbrella was passed came to feel like more than shelter. A week passed and small coincidences began to ripple. On Wednesday, Mark boarded a downtown subway car crowded with commuters. The fluorescent lights buzzing, the metallic scent of the tunnel strong, and the graffiti like punctured color. A man bumped him, spilling coffee that steamed against his shirt. And Maria happened to be there on her break, carrying a just-purchased sandwich and Lucy holding her hand. "Excuse me," Mark said politely, the tone of a man used to things being returned as expected. Maria looked up, met his eyes, and offered a napkin. "Here," she said. He accepted, their fingers brushing for a moment that felt like static in a circuit. For most people, it would have been nothing. For the two of them, it was an echo. A small human exchange. Who does not know that such echoes gather? 2 days later, in a parking lot under a pall of sodium lights and the smell of oil, Mark tripped over a loose curb and hit his head. He was dizzy, breath thick and quick. Maria, who had once taken a first aid class at the community center taught by Nurse Patel, was the first to clear the crowd. She knelt, hand firm on his shoulder, her voice calm as she asked, "Can you hear me?" The crowd murmured, cars idling, a siren fading in the distance. Mark blinked, focus returning like a window being wiped clean. "I am okay," he insisted, though his words were uneven. She stayed until the ambulance took the scene, until his assistant Jenna arrived with an embarrassed apology and a jacket, until the building security guard, Tom, offered coffee and a worried look. Those were the first 2 unexpected moments. The next moment was the one that could have been the last. A week later, Mark was in a cafe, late afternoon sun slanting across the table and the warm scent of baked bread in the air, reviewing quarterly reports. He excused himself briefly to take a call in the back alley, where the air smelled of wet cardboard and the city noise was a dull thrum. He collapsed, his face pale, his breath a whisper. Maria was walking Lucy home past that alley, Lucy's sneakers squeaking on the pavement, when she heard an odd thud and turned. Her senses sharpened into action. The alley smelt like rust and coffee grounds, a stray cat nosing through a paper bag nearby, and Mark was on the ground, his pulse faint. She called out, her voice cutting the hush, and then she was there, fingers searching for a pulse, the taste of metal at the back of her mouth from adrenaline. She recognized the pail as something she had seen in an ER when a cousin had been ill. She tilted his head, kept his airway open, and barked orders at passers-by. "Help him," she commanded, steady and direct, as if the world had given her permission to take charge. People froze, then moved, giving space. An officer named Ramirez arrived, uniform smelling of starch and rain, and took a report while Maria held Mark's hand and Lucy watched from a distance, bewildered. In the ambulance, Maria recited what she had seen and the time when symptoms had started. At the hospital, Dr. Patel took over, palms cool and precise, listening to Maria's account like someone following a map. It was a heart arrhythmia triggered by stress and an undiagnosed condition, and the immediate CPR and the quick action had altered the final statistics by a cruel but vital margin. Mark later said he did not remember who had been at his side when his eyes came back, but he remembered the color of the jacket that had been gently tucking him under a blanket when he awoke. That first hospital scene begins a sequence of long conversations and shorter ones that tilt between accusation and gratitude. At Mark's bedside, 2 staff members from his firm, Jenna and Priya, hovered with polite concern, shifting like clouds around the bed. A lawyer named Raphael called from the parking lot. His voice carried the crisp care of someone who kept schedules more than feelings. Maria sat on a stiff chair,
Lucy asleep on her lap with a small tear dried on her cheek. And Mark opened his eyes to the hospital's antiseptic scent and the hum of machines. He saw Maria, and for a moment his face was a map of confusion and sudden recognition. "You saved me," he whispered. She nodded, as if acknowledging something that belonged to both of them. "You did not leave," she said, smaller than the words deserved. The ensuing exchanges between them and the hospital staff were both ordinary and oddly intimate. Mark wanted to know her name. She told him in a plain voice, like a person reading a label on a package. Conversations unwound into offers and refusals, and over the span of hours they moved through a sequence of dialogues where Mark tried to hand her money, Jenna protested, Dr. Patel advised rest, and Officer Ramirez promised to file a report that would acknowledge her actions. The dialogue swung through pragmatic points and then landed on an offer that felt like a gust that could knock down a fragile structure. Mark insisted on finding a way to repay her, on involving his company in something that might support her future. "I cannot take money," she said. "I am a working mother. I will do what I must." The exchange stretched into a longer conversation where Mark proposed something larger than payment. The first major offer came in the office the following week, in a meeting room that smelled of lemon polish and the sharp clarity of new carpet, where glass walls refracted the city into million small versions of itself. Jenna,
Mark's assistant, arranged the meeting and clicked through slides about community outreach like a mediator handing out facts. Also present were Priya from HR, Raphael from legal, Tony, who worked on maintenance and had been asked to join as a witness, and Carlos, the landlord, who had once argued rent terms with Maria and whom she now found watching from the doorway with unexpected solemnity. Mark explained that the company had a small foundation and that he wanted it to support a program for single parents to gain stable work and study hours. "We need someone who understands the reality," he said, meeting Maria's eyes. "We need someone who can build programs that actually work." The dialogue that followed was longer than a normal hiring conversation. Maria asked about hours, about daycare assistance, about whether the company would offer flexible shifts and respect for dignity. "What if I cannot keep up with the course load?" she asked. "What if Lucy gets sick?" Mark answered directly, sometimes unsure and sometimes blunt, as CEOs can be when they are trying to change personal debts into corporate policy. "We will make space," he said. "We will create a role for you as a liaison between the foundation and the community. We will pay for your classes and provide a childcare stipend." Maria refused initially. The refusal was not dramatic. It was a careful shield against another promise that might not hold. They went back and forth for nearly an hour, with a string of voices, Jana reminding of timelines, Priya outlining paperwork, Raphael cautioning on liabilities, Tony passing a mug of coffee with hands that still bore paint flecks. 8 exchanges in that room wound into 9 and 10, each one a small step across the gulf between suspicion and possibility. At the midpoint of this story, pause for a moment and tell us about you. Before we continue, I want to hear from you. If you were in Maria's place, what would you do? Have you ever given or received a small gesture that later became something larger? Write in the comments a short line starting with "I did this" or "I would do this." Tell us, "The gesture that changed my day was," or simply type "I would help" or "I was helped." I will read a few of your comments and share them in a future follow-up, because these stories are not ideas in a vacuum. They are conversations. They are proof that a single action can connect strangers and build momentum. Your voice matters here. Now we go back to the room where decisions were made, to the documents passed across the table, to the small human hesitations that decide futures. The second major moment of tension came when the Foundation pilot program began and the realities of daily life collided with policy. Maria, now liaison with the name badge pinned at her coat, balanced training sessions with Lucy's school plays and with a landlord demanding overdue rent. The program launched with hope. The meeting room transformed into a classroom for job readiness, the coffee brewed strong, and the whiteboard filled with sticky notes in bright colors. But within weeks, the strain was visible. A supplier missed a delivery, a staff member quit, and a meeting that was supposed to include a representative from the city fell apart when the bus that was to bring parents was late. The tension built like a storm front, the air humid with worry, the fluorescent light buzzing as if impatient. Maria faced a choice when a budget cut threatened to close the childcare stipend. She organized a neighborhood meeting in the bakery below her apartment where the smell of yeast felt like invitation. And she spoke, hands warming a cup, her voice clear as she laid out the consequences. Names like Mrs. Rivera and Tony and Jenna stood up, each offering small resources. She fought for the program not only with argument, but with a ledger of real stories about parents who would lose the chance to learn. The debate lasted 2 long afternoons and a night of calls, each exchange pulling the program either toward closure or toward survival. It was a moment of tension that tested the promise of generosity and the real cost of dignity. Ultimately, the program kept its funding by reallocating small budgets and by a decision by Raphael to approve a temporary grant. The victory felt both fragile and enormous. A third moment of tension occurred when Mark's company faced public scrutiny months later after a rival published a story speculating that the foundation was a PR stunt. The article smeared intentions and questioned the sincerity of corporate giving in the quiet, precise tone of investigative piece, and the office buzz turned to a pressure like a kettle about to boil. Mark became distant, nights at the office longer, the scent of his cologne replaced by the metallic tang of worry. Maria watched as volunteers who had trusted the program felt exposed, as donors hesitated, and as a board member suggested shelving the initiative for a quarter. It felt like betrayal and worry colliding with the possibility of real harm to the people the foundation had promised to help. Maria organized testimonials, brought 5 mothers, including Mrs. Rivera and Priya's niece, into the room to tell their stories, stitched together facts and feelings and tangible outcomes. She stood steady, voice resonant, imagery of Lucy's drawings used not as token, but as proof of what continuity does. The moment lasted long enough to be heavy and short enough to be decisive. It was resolved when a local journalist named Lisa attended the meeting and wrote a piece that chronicled the program's real impact. The tide turned slowly as community voices amplified what counted most: dignity in practice over spectacle. The transformation that followed had layers. In the months after those moments, Maria assumed responsibilities that transformed not only her balance sheet, but also her emotional landscape. She led workshops, coordinated a mobile daycare unit that smelled of crayons and warm biscuits, and met with officials who smelled like new suits and old paper as they tried to understand how to replicate what they saw. People began to call her by name outside of introductions. A teacher named Priya from the adjacent community college started a night class scholarship on Maria's recommendation. Tony took on a maintenance apprenticeship paid by the program, and Carlos agreed to reduce a family's rent in exchange for volunteer hours in building improvements. Mark began to change his calendar to include the community floor, where he listened to real stories and where his own staff, once skeptical, came to see firsthand the difference a life changed made to the pace of a company's work. Small victories mounted. Lucy's new shoes did not come from a donation but from Maria's paycheck after a promotion. A certificate in social work that smelled like ink and fresh paper sat on her shelf, and the foundation measured outcomes with pride rather than press releases. Names like Nurse Patel and Officer Ramirez became part of a broader network. The offices where Maria once cleaned now hung a plaque that read something simple and human: in honor of those who lift others. The full arc reaches into a most detailed epilogue because transformations are slow and the work after a rescue is what tests a promise. 1 month later, Maria had completed the first module of her certificate program. The class had the smell of chalk and brewed tea, and the small ceremony was buoyed by a crowd including Jenna, Tony, Mrs. Rivera, Carlos, and Raphael. They took photos where Lucy clutched a ribbon and Mark stood sideways, awkward but sincere. Maria had a short speech where she thanked the people who had believed in the program, and then, more quietly, she thanked herself. She had kept her dignity in the face of gestures that could have been pity, and had insisted on reciprocity rather than charity. 3 months later, the program reported measurable outcomes. 5 mothers had completed the job readiness course, 3 had secured part-time positions with stable hours, and the mobile daycare had a roster that fit like a glove. The foundation adjusted policies to ensure flexible work and to cover emergency childcare. The company published its first independent audit showing funds allocated directly to training and housing support. On a personal level, Maria had a follow-up meeting with Priya and Raphael where they negotiated a permanent role that included time for study and an expanded stipend. She did not sign immediately. The negotiation was her way of ensuring the commitment was concrete. 6 months from that rainy day at the bus shelter, Maria had keys to a small apartment with repaired windows and a solid heater, a place where Lucy could hang art on the wall without fear of mildew. The program had expanded to 2 neighboring districts and the plaque for the courage to step in. The community response deepened in ways that were both small and enduring. Mrs. Rivera began organizing a food collective that saved families money, and the smell of shared dinners became a weekly ritual. Tony became a trainer for maintenance apprentices and taught them tools and patience in equal measure. Jenna coordinated literacy nights at the library, calling it an act of reclamation, the scent of pages and glue, a new kind of promise. Officer Ramirez led a volunteer safety net that connected neighbors to medical alert services. Nurse Patel offered free health screenings at foundation events, and the mobile unit kept a schedule that meant fewer emergency trips and calmer nights. Raphael worked with the foundation to create a legal advice clinic for those navigating paperwork and landlord disputes. Lisa, the journalist, kept following the stories that the program produced, and her articles turned skeptical readers into supporters. Together, these people formed a network that resembled an old knot tied tight against unraveling. At the center of it all stood a small symbolic object that traveled from scene to scene, the umbrella. It lived for months, propped by the community room door, dry now and repaired with a strip of bright tape, a reminder of a rainy evening when a small act was offered without expectation. In every meeting, the umbrella was a talisman of dignity. Maria would touch the handle from time to time, a private ritual that reminded her of where she had started and how far she had come. Mark kept a copy of Lucy's drawing in his office, a simple crayon house that reminded him that his life had been tethered to a chain of human acts rather than corporate strategy alone. The final reflection of this story is not a tidy bow, but a living account of what happens when a community chooses to be accountable to its most vulnerable. A single mother acted out of routine kindness and practiced skills of care learned in small places. A CEO who might have passed by instead paused and then committed resources that transformed policy and practice. The result was measurable: housing stability for one family, employment for several parents, a daycare that allowed learning to continue, and an audit that proved funds reached people. But the larger result was less quantifiable and perhaps more important. Dignity had been preserved not because of charity alone, but because of mutual recognition and sustained promise. That is the lesson that spreads like a small light. Gestures matter because they ripple into systems when people insist they must. If this story moved you, please write a short note in the comments with the prompt we left earlier. If you want to support similar programs in your area, consider connecting with your local community centers or volunteer groups. If you are here for more stories of hope and transformation, subscribe for weekly narratives that follow the people and movement. The policies that change lives. Thank you for listening to how a single umbrella, 3 unexpected moments, and the steady work of a single mother created a new kind of safety net. Remember, sometimes the warmth you need is in the small thing you choose to pass along.